Good evening, everyone, and welcome. The Arthur Ross Gallery is proud to present An Inner World, 17th Century Dutch Genre Paintings. I'm Lynn Marsden-Atlass, director of the Arthur Ross Gallery. The 10 exquisite paintings presented in this exhibition were executed by artists working in or near the city of Leiden in the Dutch Golden Age. In addition, a selection of 17th century rare books enlightens and expands the intellectual content of these paintings. In the mid-1600s, Leiden was renowned for its university, for its fine schilders, fine painters, for its textiles, and as a center of Dutch Protestant life. A centerpiece of the exhibition, Gabriel Metsu's painting, which you see here, Woman Reading by a Window, depicts a woman sitting quietly in a domestic interior, gazing at an open book in deep reflection. The painting reveals the artist's close observation not only of nature, but also of the life of the mind, both important values affirmed at Leiden University. An Inner World is co-curated by Lara Yeager-Crasselt, curator of the Leiden Collection, New York, and Heather Gibson Moqtaderi, assistant director and curator of the Arthur Ross Gallery. This is an expanded version of an exhibition Yeager-Crasselt first organized for the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts in 2017. I would like to congratulate Lara and Heather on this exceptional show and for their vision and resilience in the midst of the pandemic. I am deeply grateful to Thomas S. Kaplan and Daphne Raconti Kaplan for their generosity in lending 9 works from the Leiden collection for this exhibition, 9 paintings. I would also like to thank Olivier Mély, Hardiman Director at the Clark Art Institute, for an important loan from the Clark's collection. I'd like to extend special thanks to David Evans for his sponsorship of An Inner World from the David J. Evans Exhibition Fund. Additional support for the exhibition is provided by the J and AR Foundation, Bill and Kathy Hones, and the Patron Circle of the Arthur Ross Gallery. I want to extend my special thanks as well to Constantia Constantinou, Vice Provost and Director of Penn Libraries, John Pollock, Nicholas Herman, Sarah Rydell, and Elizabeth McDermott at the Kislak Center for Special Collections and Rare Books for lending 9 books from their collection on 17th century literature. I'd also like to thank Provost Wendell Pritchett, Mark Dingfield, and the Arthur Ross Gallery staff, Sarah Stewart, Suzanne Seisman, and our digital media intern, Reese Berman, along with Heather and myself, have been involved in all aspects of this exhibition. Support for the accompanying catalog is generously provided by a grant from the Netherlands America Foundation and the David J. Evans Exhibition Fund. The 3 essays in the catalog present new scholarship by Lara Yeager-Crasselt, Shira Brisman, Assistant Professor of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania, and Eric Jorink, the Tylers Professor of Enlightenment and Religion at Leiden University. I thank them, along with Heather Moqtaderi and Carolyn Van Kouwenberg, Curatorial Associate and Digital Coordinator at the Leiden Collection, for their important contributions to the publication. I want to share for just a minute one example. We have 3 of them right now, but you can order them online and they will be in the gallery for sale very shortly. This is distributed by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and it's a really superb catalog of scholarship and beautiful images. In an unprecedented time like this, when a global pandemic has confined us all in our homes for more than a year now, we perhaps understand and treasure these paintings and books all the more for their their introspection, and their beauty. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our co-curators, Lara Yeager-Crasselt and Heather Moqtaderi, who very shortly will have a conversation. Heather Moqtaderi is Assistant Director and Curator at the Arthur Ross Gallery at Penn. She earned her MA from the Winter Tour program in Early American Culture at the University of Delaware. And at the Arthur Ross Gallery, her most recent exhibition was rematerialized this past fall, featuring contemporary works by Ella Natsui, Sherry Mendelsohn, Jackie Malad, and Allison Sarr. Previous projects include the crowdsourced exhibition Citizen Salon and Landscape Soundscape, which paired landscape painting and photography from Penn's University Art Collection with commissioned soundscapes. Her exhibitions at other venues include Victoriana Reimagined at the Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion and Duality at the Delaware Art Museum. Heather also teaches the history of modern design as an adjunct professor at Drexel University. And Lara Yeager-Crasselt is the curator of the Leiden collection and a specialist in 17th century Dutch and Flemish art. She earned her BA from Vassar College and her PhD in art history from the University of Maryland. At the Leiden collection, she oversees scholarly research and exhibitions, including the collection's recent global exhibition tour in China, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates, all around the world. And in 2020, became co-editor of the Leiden collection catalog. Previously, Yeager-Crasselt held positions at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and at KU Leuven as a Belgian American Educational Foundation Fellow. Most recently, she also served as adjunct assistant professor of art at Vassar College. Yeager-Crasselt is the author of a book, Michael Swartz, Shaping the Artist in the Academy in Rome and Brussels, as well as numerous articles on the art of the Netherlands and Italy in the early modern period. So now it's my great pleasure to turn over this wonderful conversation between our curators. So Lara and Heather, please take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm so pleased that we are able to connect virtually for this celebration. I'd first like to thank Lynn Marsden-Atlass for her support for this exhibition, and my colleagues, Sarah Stewart and Suzanne Seisman, for all of their wonderful work, and our interns, Giovanna and Reese, for their excellent contributions, and all of the many others who played a part in making this happen. Lara, it has been so wonderful to work with you on this project for the past few years, and I'm just so pleased to be sharing our images and ideas from the exhibition with you, with our audience this evening.
Thanks, Heather. I also want to express my gratitude to you for first reaching out now about 3 years ago for the beginning of this project. It's been a great pleasure to work with you and Lynn and the entire team at the Arthur Ross Gallery. I'd also like to extend my thanks to our catalog contributors, our authors, our editor, my team at the Leiden collection, Sarah, Caroline, and Kim, and also, of course, to Thomas Kaplan and Daphne Riccanati Kaplan for making these kinds of projects possible and their generosity in sharing the collection. So I'm delighted to dive into an inner world with you here today, Heather.
Wonderful. And before we begin our conversation, we would like to share some sneak peek images with everyone who has joined us this evening. An Inner World is an exhibition of 9 paintings loaned from the Leiden collection in New York, 1 painting from the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and 9 rare 17th century books from Penn Library's Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts. The exhibition layout is designed around several key themes, which we will outline in tonight's conversation. And so here we begin with this wonderful Metsu image. And Lara, I'd like to ask you to begin our conversation. And would you please talk about the meaning of the concept and inner world?
Yes, so the concept for the inner world for me actually began with the idea of quiet, of thinking about what happens when we retreat into whether a small interior space or when we retreat into ourselves, when we have a moment to think, to contemplate, to reflect, and that sense of interiority, but also about being removed from the outer world. And it also involves this idea of quiet exchange with another person or a small group of people, and what happens in those quiet moments, both in terms of mind and body. And these ideas take shape in various ways in the exhibition, as we'll explore this evening. But as much as it's about what is depicted in these works of art, it's also about the experience of looking at them and how we, as viewers, or how 17th century viewers would have interacted. And really to prompt the viewer to enter into a kind of quiet dialogue with the works of art themselves that they're looking at. And in many ways, the painting that we see here, Gabriel Metsu's Woman Reading a Book by a Window, is this incredible painting from the mid 1650s by an artist who was born in Leiden, received his early training there. And just about the time he completed this work, he would go on to move to the bigger city of Amsterdam. And we're looking at a woman that's seated in an interior space, and kind of casually, she's propped herself up on this small table in the foreground. There's a book propped up on an open windowsill before her, other books open behind her in this kind of small, tight space. But with the window being open, we have a sense of light and air coming in inside. And Metsu has positioned this composition for the viewer in a very interesting way, because we feel very close to her, that we're really almost in this sort of inner world with her, but also, right, we're very much separated from that. So there's this interesting play. She's not actually focused on the words on the page. She's been reading, but she's distracted now by something. And her eyes are sort of gazing just over the top of the book and probably out of the window. She's thinking about something else. So she's really retreated into the space of her own mind. She's come into her own inner world. And we're invited to contemplate that inner world with her.
And at the outset of your catalog essay, you talk about her costume and it being an antique costume, not of its contemporary moment. And I think that's an important aspect of thinking through this painting. So could you talk a bit about her costume?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a central aspect of looking at this, because though we seem like we very well may be here in a 17th century Dutch kind of domestic interior, she's not wearing 17th century clothes, but rather something quite antiquated. This beautiful sort of scarlet velvet robe with a white blouse beneath it, a brooch at her chest, a probably black velvet beret with this wonderful red feather falling just beside her face. And so she belongs really to another time, and not necessarily to the present moment here. And by depicting her in this way, Metsu seems to allude to more of an abstract idea, very well perhaps the idea of knowledge or understanding itself. And this suggestion, which was first made by Adrian Weibor about Metsu's work here, really puts the painting in dialogue with an emblem book, which is in the exhibition here at the Arthur Ross Gallery by the Italian author Cesare Ripa, who composed the Iconologia in the late 16th century. It's a type of book where it's interrelated texts and images. And here we see the idea, right, the embodiment of knowledge or understanding is indeed a woman seated before an open book, holding actually a large torch behind her, and there's also an open window just to her right. And so Metsu very likely looked to this image. There was a Dutch edition published in the 1640s. And so he seems to really be playing with these abstract ideals with the immediacy of this inner world that we're experiencing here. And I do also want to say, this is a huge painting. You may have gotten a glimpse of it in the sneak peek we showed you. It's about, nearly 3 feet wide, 3 feet tall. And so she's close to life size. So that has a real impact in how you interact with the painting. And I show you here in comparison, these are scaled to each other, scaled to size. Peter von Slingeland's Portrait of a Man Reading a Book, which is another work in the show, vastly different. The Metsu painting is the largest painting in the show, and the experience of standing before her or standing before the Slingeland is obviously a very different one. And while many of the works, with the exception of the Metsu, in the exhibition are meant to be viewed up close, and that's part of this experience of looking at them in a close, intimate way. Slingeland's painting is obviously tiny. It's executed on copper in a very refined, meticulous style. But he too, right, has paused from reading, paused from some kind of intellectual labor that he's undertaking. He's seated in an interior space, reading a book. His finger is just caught in the pages where we've kind of interrupted him, and he stopped to look at us. He's wearing what is known as a Japanese robe, which upper middle class men would often wear in the space of the home when they were undertaking scholarly pursuit. And so this is also the inner world. And this exhibition begins to show us some of really the expanse of that idea and how it could take shape in various ways.
So this painting ties into the origins of this exhibition. So in 2017, you were interim curator of paintings and sculpture at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And let me take a moment to say we're so thankful to the Clark for allowing us to use the original name of the exhibition, An Inner World, 17th Century Genre Painting, and for the loan of this incredible painting. So Lara, while we're on this image, would you please talk about the origins of the exhibition and how it was originally developed?
Yeah, absolutely. So this painting, as the Metsu, was really fundamental to how the concept for the show developed. And it began in many ways in dialogue with this work at the Clark, Gerrit Douw's Girl at a Window. Douw is known as the founder of the Leiden School of Fine Painters, of Fine Schilders. And he was a pupil also of Rembrandt in the late 1620s, and then goes in a very different direction than his master. In the 1630s, he begins to paint, again, with this really meticulous, refined brushwork. And just to give you a sense of what that could mean, that he was also known to take a very long time to execute his paintings, and could even do so with a brush of just a single hair, a few hairs. So that to get that level of refinement. And so Douw's technique invites this kind of close looking to really be drawn into his pictorial worlds. So the painting at the Clark had been in the collection for about 60 years or so, but hadn't really been on view for much of that time. And in 2016, we undertook conservation of the painting at the Williamstown Art Conservation Center. And then the painting was newly reinstalled in the galleries. And what we see here is Dao depicting a very different kind of subject matter than our painting by von Slingelandt or Metsu, and that we're looking at a kitchen maid painting from the mid 1650s. But it represents a motif that Dao had developed in the 1640s, which is this stone window ledge or niche in which a figure leans out of the space, seemingly almost coming into our own real world. And this was a trope of illusionism that Dao developed. And one might think when you're standing in front of the painting, maybe at least for a moment, because the light seems to be coming from outside the painting rather than from in the painting. Of course, it's also all part of the illusion, right? One might think, is she actually leaning out of a space, or is this all part of Dao's clever pictorial world? But this painting also develops part of the idea of the outer world, and that as much as we might retreat in, there's always something, right, the other boundary on the other side. And so what happens when figures may cross that space and lean out seemingly into our world was another theme that I started to develop and think about with this painting.
If I may interject, this is the image that we chose to blow up for the front wall when you first walk in the gallery. And I think one of the reasons that we decided to do that is because it's kind of a treat to see this at a larger scale, because the painting is quite small. And so I hope many of you do come visit the exhibition in the gallery. This is the image that will greet you. And I think that trompe l'oeil effect is enhanced by the way that we've expanded the image.
Absolutely.
So our current version of An Inner World at the Arthur Ross Gallery is a new and expanded version of that original. Some paintings were added, and of course we have the addition of the loans of rare books from the Kislak Center. So I think we should take some time to talk about how the exhibition was expanded. And Lara, if you would start by talking about the paintings.
Yeah. So that was one of the wonderful parts of this project to work together with you too, because you were seeing all these works for the first time and with new eyes. So that was great for me, so we could be in dialogue over this. But so for example, Dao's Old Woman at a Window with a Candle, which is about 2 decades later than the Clark painting, you see him continuing that motif as he often did, of a figure leaning outside of this ledge. But he combines this with his nocturnal scene and artificial illumination of his candlelight. So this sort of takes the subject matter sort of another level of illusionism by having now a curtain pulled to the side. There's a bird cage hanging above her. There's also actually a couple in the background, and yet another form of illumination, a fireplace. And very prominently in the foreground is Dao's signature, peeling off this piece of paper, kind of peeling off the stone ledge. So Dao really kind of pushes how we think about this concept of the inner world, but also that threshold with the outer world. And that acts in dialogue with works by several of Dao's pupils, which are part of the exhibition, such as Dominicus von Toll's Boy with a Mousetrap by Candlelight, which we see here. Again, candlelight became a very popular motif in the latter part of the 17th century. And von Toll was also playing, he sort of removed the ledge, but that cabbage in the foreground seems to hover right on the edge of the picture frame with this sort of wine barrel, and he's holding a mousetrap. So these paintings really help to expand the themes of the show, to think about them in new directions. And another is von Toll's Children at a Window Blowing Bubbles. And Dao had a number of pupils throughout the 17th century that continued to paint in this technique of fine painting well into the later 17th and then turn of the 18th century. Von Toll, Peter von Slingelandt, who we saw earlier, was also a pupil of Dao. And this painting plays with a lot of those themes. We see the stone window ledge, right? The curtain pulled to the side. Now we have a plant, a pot of flowers in our space, our outer world. A relief below by the Flemish sculptor Francois Duquesnoy. But the illusionism here is also about the motif of blowing bubbles, that these children, you see these lovely highlights on the bubbles floating above, and coming in a play of inner and outer worlds. But bubbles are also a vanitas motif, a reminder of the transience of life. And so the bubbles juxtaposed with, if you look past the children into the back room, you see also a skull and an hourglass, right, alluding to this passing of time. So Van Tol picks up on a number of these symbolic motifs, but also that technique of fine painting to create this lovely dialogue. So in addition to the paintings that were added to the show, really a crucial element here was to think more broadly about the intellectual and cultural context of the show. And that was really done through this really wonderful experience of working with the Kislak Center and together, Heather, and also with Shira Brisman to delve into these books. So Heather, if you'd like to take us through some of the highlights of the books in the exhibition.
Sure, and it was such a wonderful opportunity to work with the Kislak Center. And as you mentioned, I want to make sure to recognize Shira Brisman, who participated in those early study sessions organized by John Pollack and Nicholas Herman. And the books that we pulled together are such a wonderful complement in expanding the themes of the exhibition. You've already talked about volume 2 of Ripa's Iconologia, which is shown on the right here with the image of cognition. And you had included a different edition and printing of that book in the original exhibition. And we thought, this is such a key theme, and there's such a tangible relationship between that window and the woman in the book that it was definitely something that had to be included in this exhibition. The book on the left is the volume 1 of Ripa's Iconologia, and that depicts a really interesting antiquated alchemist. And you might be able to make it out on your screen. He's wearing a swan headdress, which is tying into one of the phases of alchemy, and surrounded by all kinds of interesting alchemical accoutrements. And on the next slide, we have another book represented on the left that ties into alchemy. This is by an author who was also, very studious in the study of minerals. And I want to read the official full title of this book. The title is Silver River or King's Fountain, in which many notable medicines of the old philosophers are discovered, and of the salt and sulfur of metals, and what kinds of powers of medicine are hidden in those, as well as on the life and death of the metals and minerals, their paints and tinctures, extracts. So using this text, we're able to reference the way that alchemy in the 17th century expanded into other scientific practices, such as medicine, which is a field where there was great scholarship and accomplishment in the city of Leiden, which is our subject for the exhibition, most famously known through the city of Leiden's anatomical theater. So this same author, Rieswick, on the left, often in other publication used images by Jakob Katz. And on the right-hand side, we have Katz's Mirror of Old and New Time. And much like Ripa's work, this is an emblem book with interrelated text and images. In this case, we have this allegorical image of ignorance with an owl's head foolishly running after Prudence, who is represented as this calm woman carefully stepping forward with a book in her hand and this exaggerated oversized quill. And Lara, in some of our conversations about emblem books, you had talked about how they were not only intended for the intellectual elite or highly educated, but they were very popularly referenced. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that use of emblem books in popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there was such an enormously wide audience for emblem books, especially by Jacob Cats, who was probably one of, if not the most popular Dutch authors and moralists in the 17th century. And this is one of a number of emblem books that he published. And these were, for everyone in a way. And I think you could read them as closely as you wanted, or to be able to look at the images and really learn something from it, have this sort of instruction but delight, but also to kind of take pleasure. And there's some level of enjoyment and playfulness of reading the text, looking at the image, and kind of understanding how they relate to one another. And they were also really became, like Ripa's book and Katz's as well, kind of visual source book for artists as a way to draw on different allegorical themes or moral sayings. So there's this really, it's important how they permeated the culture in this period.
Yeah, wonderful, certainly. Thank you. And then just to highlight a couple more books, on the left, we have Anna Maria von Schurman's dissertation. And while this is a less decorative object, it's so important because it represents the writing of the first Dutch woman to attend university. And in this dissertation, she argues for the education of women using moral grounds. And in the exhibition, we tie it into the Kotz illustration because she argues on the grounds that ignorance leads to vice and that women should be educated for that reason. And on the right-hand side, we have a book by Johannes van Meurs. And this is a book of biographies and engraved portraits of important professors from Leiden University. It's something that may have been popularly distributed and sold in the city of Leiden, sometimes to tourists or people collecting ephemera related to the city. And I think that's actually a great tie-in for talking about the city of Leiden itself, which has a really significant presence for this exhibition.
Right.
And so for those of you who aren't familiar, Leiden is a city about 35 miles southwest of Amsterdam. And I think in our next slide, we have a painting that, a print that illustrates the library of Leiden University. So it was also known as a prominent sort of religious center and center of university life. And Lara, I don't know if you want to start talking a little bit about the city of Leiden as it plays into the works in the exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that was touched upon in the sort of first iteration of the show, but we really developed that and expanded the context, the cultural, intellectual, and scientific context of Leiden. And in so many ways, the theme of the show develops naturally around the work of Douw and his students and these themes in Leiden. I should say, though, it was certainly not the only artistic center where artists treated these themes or this subject matter, right? Not by any means. But I think that Leiden's context provided an important framework for artists working in this tradition. And I think it really impacted how they approached the subject matter and what was going on around them. I mean, Leiden was a university city, is a university city still today. It is the oldest university in the Northern Netherlands. It was founded in 1575. And by the early decades of the 17th century, before even many of these artists that we're talking about today were working, it was just a thriving intellectual center. And students had come from across Europe to study in Leiden. And you have a taste here of looking at this wonderful print of the Leiden University Library. to, students came to study philosophy and the classics and literature, languages, and also sort of new sciences. And in part here, that is, we see here, as Heather mentioned before, anatomical theater, which was not only open to students, but also to the public. And so there's a culture here that we were able to explore through the books and through this whole culture of what was going on in Leiden. And I did want to, mention this idea that Erik Jorenk in his essay in the catalog characterizes this so-called eye for detail of the city of Leiden, which I think is a wonderful way for thinking about the inner world and what was going on here. That not only was Leiden a university city, it was also a publishing center, it was a textile center, with the advances in science and in optics and the microscope, and really looking at new ways, the study of the natural world, observation, seeing things that you literally people hadn't seen before in quite that same way, all really contributes to an attention and this eye for detail, which intersects in really fascinating ways with the work of Leiden fine painters like Dow and his pupils.
And so you and I in conversation have talked about this notion of the eye for detail. And as you mentioned in Erik Jorenk's essay, he really beautifully contextualizes the worlds of manufacturing and scientific inquiry, along with the arts. And we talked about Van Mieris's Hermit being a great example in the detail that you can see. So I think, would you share some of your thoughts on how this piece represents that eye for detail?
Yeah, this is a painting thinking about this, about the same size as the Peter van Slingeland painting of Portrait of a Man Reading that we started with a little while ago. It's also on copper, so this really incredibly meticulously painted little gem of a painting, and it shows this elderly figure out in the wilderness in a kind of cave or grotto, and he is really retreated to pray, to read, to reflect. And he's seated with his hands clasped in prayer, his eyes down, focused on the page before him. And we see the skull in the foreground, the crucifix in front of him as well. And these objects prompt ideas of vanitas, right? That reminder of one's own mortality, of the transience of life. And Willem van Mieris was the son of Frans van Mieris, who was a renowned Leiden fine painter. Frans van Mieris had been the pupil of Gerrit Douw, and Willem van Mieris really continues this tradition of fine painting well into the 18th century. So you see in the exhibition, in a way, really the beginning of that tradition of fine schilders going all the way, this painting is from 1707. And what van Mieris is also in his painting technique here, this attention to realism of capturing the veins on this man's hands, the wrinkles on his forehead, the texture of his beard. And if you look really closely, and if you to visit the exhibition, to get up close to the painting, to even see that there's dirt under his fingernails. And so this kind of subject matter, painting technique of drawing you in, not only to an inner world of the mind or of the spirit, but also the inner world of how you observe and look at and think about these paintings yourself. And so in a way, this really kind of sums up and really draws together a lot of the themes of the show.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think our next image is the catalog, because we can't cover everything in this talk, but all of the works that we've shown this evening and many more are included in this beautiful exhibition catalog, which is available through the University of Pennsylvania Press, who we are so thankful for being such a wonderful collaborator. And I think we will get the website linked in the chat that you can use to purchase the catalog. And of course, you can also purchase one when you come see an Inner World in person. But I want to reiterate, how wonderful it was to work with Lynn from the Arthur Ross Gallery, Shira Brisman, Eric Yorink, and of course, you, Lara, and the amazing editor, Kristen Swan. And I can't say enough wonderful things about this catalog. And I do hope the folks here who are interested will pursue obtaining a copy.
I think, Heather, there's one thing to just jump in for a moment too. You see the kind of header on the top of Shira's essay, and this is another, Shira takes a wonderful look at these two paintings by Metsu, our woman that we know now on the left, and on the right, Metsu's public notary, which you can see there already plays with this idea of Dow's window niche motif. And when I talked about earlier this idea of the sort of inner outer world, Shira delves into these ideas of both sort of the private and the public, character of the worlds and what comes out in these paintings. So it's an important side to how we look at these works in this context. So I'm grateful that we were able to really expand on these ideas. So thank you both again.
Yeah, I will say all of your essays are so much in dialogue with one another. It's a really wonderful set of essays. So Lara, if it's all right with you at this point, I think maybe I'll take a peek at the Q&A. And I do see there are 2 questions that we can begin to address, but I'll say to everyone, please feel free to type questions into the Q&A if you would like them addressed this evening. And I see we have 3. So the first one, Lara, if I may read this to you, this person is wondering about the way that the subjects were sitting for the artist, or can you describe the process of how a subject might have been a part of the artist's painting process? They're asking about if the people sat for the artists.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. For a formal portrait by Peter von Slingeland that we looked at earlier of Man Interrupted Reading, we don't know who that individual was. And oftentimes in portraits from this period, the identity of the sitters they're sort of lost to us, unfortunately. So we don't know who he is. But it's likely that he would have probably sat for the artist at some point. But in a lot of these other cases, these works may have come from both artists drawing, models, working from life, but then going back to the studio, and what we kind of refer to in Dutch as uit den geest, or out of the imagination, out of the mind. And so these images seem incredibly real, but they're very rarely painted entirely from life. But it's interesting, as I'm looking at the Metsu again, she has such distinctive features, individualized features. So it's hard to imagine that she wouldn't have been someone maybe that Metsu knew or saw, because she's not a generic face by any means. Thank you, though, for that question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And your response is so poignant in relation to the concept of the inner world, thinking about, some of these figures coming from the mind or from the imagination. Right, so we have another question. This is from Dr. Sarah Kadagan. Lara, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm curious about the potential religious undertones to many of these pictures, particularly given the religious climate of the largely Protestant Dutch Republic during the 17th century. Could you speak to any connections among the gorgeous works in the exhibition and the potential link to the long-standing Roman Catholic monastic tradition of the Vita Contemplativa and the Vita Attiva, here perhaps made more Protestant in these secular paintings?
Wow, that's a very good question, a very large question, but it's important. It's something we actually haven't touched upon really this evening, which is, well, a couple of different things. On the one hand, Leiden was actually a city at the heart of some really intense religious debates in the 17th century within the Calvinist Church. So the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, was Protestant, was officially Calvinist, and there was the more conservative and the more liberal aspects, sides to this church, the remonstrants and the counter-remonstrants. And Leiden and the university really fed the debates that were taking place, particularly in the earlier part of the century. But I think that kind of intensity of what was going on in the city really must have impacted artists, and it certainly did, in the 1620s, like Rembrandt and Jan Lievens, for example. But I think artists like Douw too must have been acutely aware of what was going on. These images, particularly of Willem van Mieris, it's interesting, I can go back for a moment. He's not specifically identified as Saint Jerome, and he did actually, as Douw did a number of images of hermits as well. This becomes part of a larger idea of the contemplative life, not directly related to Catholicism, but the importance in Protestantism of the written word, of having that direct relation, that intimate connection to the text yourself, becomes so important. And I think the last thing I'll just mention, is something that Eric talks about in his essay and his scholarship, that nature itself was really seen as God's work, the book of nature. The Bible was the most important book, but nature, the book of nature, was the second. And that idea that God's presence is visible in every aspect of the world around us happens in parallel with the developments in science. And so one doesn't necessarily replace the other, but these really heated debates of religion and science continue well into the late 17th century. Thank you, great question.
Wonderful. And we actually have two questions, both asking about the the commissioning of the paintings and I guess that relates to provenance. So this is the perfect question for you as the curator of the Leiden collection, and I'm sure you're familiar with the history of the Clark's Douw as well. But can you speak to how these would have been purchased, whether they would have been commissioned, and by whom, and which? We have a couple of questions ask about class as well.
Yeah, so it's an important thing to think about the early collecting history, the provenance of these paintings. Oftentimes we don't know who were the original owners, if they would have been commissioned. Many artists in this period of the Dutch Republic were working for the open market, not exclusively. There were certainly specific aspects of collecting or patronage, but generally there was a lively market for art. And so typically these scenes, these genre scenes, how we refer to them as these so-called scenes of everyday life, probably would have been made for the open market and not necessarily for a collector, but there are absolutely exceptions to that. And the Metsu painting of the woman, seated before the window, this painting has always raised questions for me in terms of for whom it was originally intended, because it's so large. And whereas the smaller cabinet-sized paintings would have had, an audience and a place to hang in people's homes, a painting like this is on the scale of a history painting of a biblical subject or a mythological subject, which leads one to suspect that Metsu had perhaps a patron in mind for this work. And did I miss the second part of the question? Or maybe that covers it.
I think that covers it very well. Thank you. We have another question in the Q&A. Is the portrait of the woman in the costume, Metsu's woman, considered a troney?
So that's a tricky question. I don't consider her a troney. So a troney is a Dutch word for an individualized character study. In contrast to a portrait. A portrait we think of, right, as a formal portrait, something commissioned. There's a sitter. A troney, to my mind, really refers to something where it's there's not context to it. It's a head study, often done from life, finished, but can also be a type of oil sketch. Studies about individuals' facial features, light and shadow. Whereas the Metsu painting, because this is a full composition, she's seated in an interior of what she's wearing, what she's doing. This has a kind of narrative aspect to it, also allegorical aspect to it. And it really belongs probably more towards the realm of a kind of history painting than a straightforward genre painting. So I would not, if it was just her face, perhaps I would, think of her as a troney, but I wouldn't in this instance.
Wonderful. So we're nearing the end of our hour. So if we, I'd like to just tell people about the program that will be offered as part of this exhibition, if there are no more questions in the Q&A, because we do want you to know that while our opening is virtual, you are encouraged to come in person to the Arthur Ross Gallery at the University of Pennsylvania, 220 South 34th Street. And for those of you who are out of town, there are all sorts of wonderful things going on at the University of Pennsylvania's museum, and as well as the Institute of Contemporary Art. Philadelphia Museum of Art is just down the street. So please make a day of it, even if you don't live in Philadelphia. But the programs moving forward are all going to be virtual. Please join us on May 7th at noon for Elizabeth Berry Drago's talk, Gold Making, Painting, Alchemy, and Virtuosity in Dutch Art. And Lara will actually be facilitating that discussion. And then on Friday, May 21st, also at noon, we'll be having Nicole Cook from the Philadelphia Museum of Art presenting Inner Worlds and Late Hours, Nocturnal Imagery in Dutch Genre Painting. And so that should tie in really nicely with some of those candlelit scenes included in the exhibition. And that will be moderated by Shira Brisman. And every first Wednesday, we'll have a program at noon, a 12-minute talk, and you can see the dates here on different aspects of the exhibition. And then one very special project that we'll be having is the Filament Baroque Ensemble, who are here in Philadelphia, will be performing period chamber music, and they'll be recording their performance in the gallery. And then on June 17th at 6 p.m., we will debut that performance and follow it up with a Q&A with the musicians. So please join us for that. Please come to the exhibition. And Lara, thank you so much for this incredible conversation and collaboration. And there's much more to do because we have all of these programs coming up.